Espionage. It's a word that just sounds, well, kind of sophisticated, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Almost like it's got this built-in air of, well, Britishness, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And there's a reason for that. I mean, the word itself, espion, the spy that came from the French,
Mhm.
right, first popped up in English back in 1793.
Right, right.
But when you think spy novels, it's the Brits who really come to mind. They took that seed, and grew this whole literary tradition around it. John le Carré, for instance.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Le Carré, a master of the genre, no question. But what's interesting is that the whole idea of spying, of secrets and hidden motives, it goes way, way back. Before we had all the fancy gadgets and shadowy organizations, there were other stories that's the stage, stories that captured that same fascination with what's hidden beneath the surface.
So before we get into the world of Le Carré and his Cold War tales, let's rewind a bit. What were those earlier stories, those literary ancestors, that paved the way for espionage fiction as we know it today?
Well, you've got to start with the really big ones, the foundational narratives of Western literature, the epics, the romances.
Okay, so like the Odyssey or Beowulf kind of epic.
Exactly. Those heroic journeys, the epic battles, the sense of national destiny. That's one side of the coin. And then you have the romances, those more personal stories, often involving hidden identities, secret love affairs, clandestine relationships.
Okay, so those two big storytelling traditions, epic and romance, started to kind of blend together over time.
Precisely. It's a weaving together of these narrative threads. But then in the 19th century, you see a real shift, a crystallization, with the emergence of crime fiction. And within that, you get some fascinating subgenres that lay the groundwork for the spy novel.
Like those Newgate novels I've heard about. What was the deal with those?
Oh, they were huge. A real publishing phenomenon in the 1830s and 40s. Essentially, they romanticized the lives of criminals.
Romanticized criminals. Sounds a bit controversial.
It was. They often drew their inspiration directly from the Newgate calendar, which was like a chronicle of the criminal underworld.
Yeah.
A who's who of the most notorious criminals of the day.
Wow. So they were literally taking these real-life criminals and making them into characters.
Yes, and they weren't just depicting them neutrally. Authors like Edward Bulwer Lytton and Harrison Ainsworth often portrayed these criminals as, well, almost heroic figures, sometimes even victims of social injustice. You can imagine how that stirred things up in Victorian society.
Oh, yeah, I bet. So they were using these criminal narratives as a way to comment on social issues, too.
Exactly. Even Dickens, with Oliver Twist and Barnaby Rudge, explored some of these themes. He used the genre to critique the legal system and the harsh realities of poverty. So the focus wasn't so much on solving a crime, it was more about delving into the lives and motivations of those operating outside the law.
Okay, so less whodunit and more who are they? That's a really interesting distinction.
Precisely. But then, moving a bit later into the 1860s, you have another fascinating shift with the sensation novels. This subgenre brought crime into the seemingly respectable world of Victorian society.
Oh, so instead of criminals being out there in some separate underworld, the threat is right there in your drawing room.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing about sensation novels is that many of them were written by women and featured female protagonists.
Oh, wow. So they were pushing boundaries in multiple ways then.
Absolutely. Authors like Wilkie Collins with The Woman in White and Mary Braddon, they really started to emphasize the puzzle of the crime itself, the act of detection. Even Dickens's Great Expectations was considered a sensation novel by some. And the act of uncovering secrets, well, that becomes a much more central element in the storytelling.
It makes sense, that evolution, from focusing on the criminal, the who, to figuring out what happened, the how. That feels like a direct line to the classic detective fiction we all know and love.
A very direct line. And of course, detective fiction really took off first in America with writers like Hawthorne and Poe, and then later in Britain with, of course, the one and only Sherlock Holmes, created by Conan Doyle.
And Sherlock Holmes was all about that rational deduction, right? Using logic to solve the mystery.
Exactly, meticulously piecing together clues, often with multiple suspects, each with their own possible motives.
Like a puzzle.
Precisely. Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone is another great early example. It's all about solving the mystery through careful observation and logical reasoning.
Okay, so we've got venture from the epics, a touch of romance, the exploration of crime from those Newgate and sensation novels, and then the puzzle-solving element from detective fiction. How does all of that transform into the world of spies and secret agents? How do we get to espionage fiction?
Well, espionage fiction is like a close cousin of detective fiction. But the big difference is that there isn't always a clearly defined crime in the traditional sense.
So it's not about finding a murderer or a stolen jewel.
Not necessarily. The central element is usually a secret, something hidden, a conspiracy waiting to be exposed. And that secret, that act of concealment, that becomes the crime itself.
So the crime is the secret itself.
Exactly. And while there are some who argue that you can find early elements of spycraft in literature, in ancient Chinese novels like Sanquo in the Western tradition, it really starts to emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Initially, it's woven into broader adventure stories and political thrillers, but it really gains traction the years leading up to World War I and the period between the wars.
So thinking about that time period, the early 20th century, what were the major events or tensions on the world stage that were shaping the early spy novels?
Well, you had some pretty massive shifts in global power happening. Germany unified in 1871, which created a new, powerful nation right in the heart of Europe.
And Germany had its own colonial ambitions, right, which put them in direct competition with Britain.
Absolutely. This Anglo-German rivalry became a huge source of anxiety for the British. I mean, they had been the dominant global power for so long.
Right. It's no surprise that the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was officially founded in 1909.
Right around that time, yeah. And there was a real fear, a sometimes exaggerated fear, of German spies infiltrating British society.
It wasn't just Britain, though. The United States was also starting to formalize its own intelligence agencies during this period.
That's right. And in Russia, after the revolution, you had the creation of the Cheka in 1917. So you see this global trend towards the professionalization of espionage.
A whole new era of state-sponsored spying. So how did all of this play out in the spy novels of the time? What kinds of stories were they telling?
Many of them tapped directly into that fear of the German threat, the anxiety about a potential invasion. Erskine Schiller's The Riddle of the Sands, published in 1903, is a classic example.
Oh, yeah, The Riddle of the Sands. It's about a potential German invasion plot using yachts, right?
Yes, set in the Frisian Islands. And what's fascinating is that the German Navy actually did consider a plan like that.
Wow, so it wasn't just pure fiction. It had some real strategic basis.
It did. Childers always claimed it was purely fictional, but British naval intelligence took it seriously enough to analyze it for its potential strategic implications.
That's incredible. It really captures the paranoia of the time. But it wasn't just Germany, right? There was also that tension with Russia, that whole great game thing I read about.
Ah, yes, the Great Game. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain and Russia were locked in this intense rivalry for influence in Central Asia.
And that rivalry fueled a lot of Russophobia in Britain, didn't it?
Absolutely. You see it reflected in the literature of the time. Rudyard Kipling's Kim, published in 1901, is a prime example. It reflects those Anglo-Russian tensions playing out in the context of India. Even after Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, that perception of Russia as a threat lingered in the British imagination.
So you've got these two major sources of anxiety, Germany and Russia feeding into the early spy narratives, and then World War I breaks out. How does that change things?
World War I very clearly cemented Germany as the primary enemy in spy fiction. The stories became much more explicitly patriotic. There was a real emphasis on duty, on defending the nation against this perceived threat.
And John Buchan's Richard Hannay novels really capture that wartime spirit, don't they?
Absolutely. The 39 Steps, probably the most famous one, is a great example. You have these clandestine enemy networks operating within Britain, and this lone, heroic British agent fighting against them. Interestingly, Buchan based Hannay partly on a real British army officer who worked in intelligence in Russia.
So what happened to spy fiction after the war? Did it maintain that same level of nationalistic fervor?
Well, the interwar period brought some interesting shifts. While some authors continued in that same vein, others started to take a more nuanced approach. Somerset Maugham's Ashendon stories, published in 1928, are really important in this shift.
What was different about Maugham's stories?
Maugham himself had worked for British intelligence during the war, and his stories are based on his own experiences. They offer a much more realistic, almost jaded view of spies. His spies are ordinary people doing a job that's often morally ambiguous, a far cry from the larger-than-life heroes in earlier spy fiction.
That's interesting. So the spy is no longer necessarily this romanticized figure.
Exactly. And le Carré himself acknowledged Maugham's influence, praising his realism. Another key author from this period is Eric Ambler. He also moved away from purely patriotic narratives, exploring more complex political landscapes and moral dilemmas.
It seems like the public perception of spying itself was evolving, too.
Yes, definitely. It shifted from something seen as perhaps ungentlemanly to a necessary, if unpleasant, tool of statecraft, especially as the threat of another world war loomed larger.
And then, of course, comes the Cold War. It seems like that era was tailor-made for espionage fiction, this stark ideological battleground, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
The Cold War was a game changer, absolutely. This very clear ideological divide between the West and the Soviet bloc, it just fueled the imagination.
Mm.
Key events like the Yalta Conference, the division of Europe, the Berlin Wall, they all created this world where secrets were paramount, and the threat from the other side was omnipresent.
It put espionage front and center in popular culture in a way that it had never been before.
Absolutely. And another really interesting thing about Cold War spy fiction is that a lot of the authors had direct experience in the world of intelligence.
Oh, right, like Graham Greene, who had worked for MI6.
Exactly,
Sure.
and John le Carré, of course. And Ian Fleming, who held a senior position in naval intelligence during World War II. Having that insider knowledge, that real-world experience, it lent a whole new level of authenticity to their writing. Some even wrote under pseudonyms to maintain a degree of separation from their official duties, like William Haggard, who was actually Richard Clayton.
Let's talk about Ian Fleming and James Bond. He's the ultimate spy icon, isn't he? That image of the suave secret agent, gadgets galore, battling villains in exotic locations. It's so ingrained in our culture.
Fleming and Bond, they really captured the public imagination. Fleming drew on his own experiences in naval intelligence, but he obviously added a lot of glamour, a lot of fantasy. Bond is this larger-than-life figure. He's got the gadgets, the fast cars, the beautiful women, and he's always battling this clearly defined villain, often representing some evil organization.
So it's a very clear-cut good versus evil kind of dynamic.
Exactly. And even though the plots are often fantastical, Fleming grounds them in a recognizable reality. He uses real brand names, contemporary settings, he even structures his novels around classic heroic archetypes. It's very clever. Now, of course, Bond was criticized for being a bit simplistic, a bit too black and white in its portrayal of the Cold War. It lacks the nuance and moral ambiguity that you find in some other spy fiction.
And that's where an author like Len Deighton comes in, right?
Yeah.
He offered a much more grounded, realistic view of the spy world.
Absolutely. Dayton was a great counterpoint to Fleming. His protagonist, initially nameless and then later known as Harry Palmer in the film adaptations, is this working-class, cynical anti-hero. He's a world away from the polished, sophisticated James Bond.
So it's a much grittier, less glamorous portrayal of espionage.
Exactly. There's a sense of weariness, of disillusionment. Even in Dayton's novels, you get a real sense of the emotional toll that this clandestine life takes on people. He also incorporated documentary-style techniques into his writing, which added to that sense of realism. His later Bernard Sampson trilogy really delves into the long-term psychological impact of the Cold War on those involved in intelligence work.
So Dayton was more about the human cost, the toll of deception and secrecy, rather than the glamorous side of spying.
Precisely. Now, Dayton was very successful and critically acclaimed, but le Carré is generally considered to have achieved a greater level of literary recognition.
Did American fiction also embrace the themes of espionage during the Cold War?
Oh, absolutely. The Manchurian Candidate by Richard Condon is a classic example. It's a chilling exploration of brainwashing and political manipulation during the Cold War. Really tapped into the anxieties of the time.
It's fascinating to see how this genre evolved to reflect the changing geopolitical landscape. We've talked a lot about fictional spies, but what about the real ones? What actually drives people to betray their own countries to become spies for the other side?
It's a question that's fascinated people for ages. A useful way to think about it is through the acronym MICE: money, ideology, coercion or compromise, and ego or excitement.
MICE. Okay, so starting with money, I guess that's a pretty straightforward motive.
Yeah, financial gain is a big one. Studies of captured American spies during the Cold War showed that money was a key factor for many of them. Then you have ideology. A strong belief in a different political or social system can be incredibly motivating. People willing to risk everything for their beliefs.
And sex has also played a role throughout history, hasn't it? I mean, there's the classic image of the femme fatale, like Mata Hari.
Absolutely. And then there were the KGB sparrows, women trained to seduce and compromise Western targets. And Western intelligence agencies used honey traps and Romeo spies as well. Sex has always been a tool in the espionage game. Then there's coercion or compromise, essentially blackmail, being caught in a compromising position and forced to cooperate.
Makes sense. And finally, ego or excitement. I guess some people are just drawn to the thrill of the secret life, the danger and intrigue.
Yes, the allure of living a double life. And sometimes the reality of intelligence work can be pretty mundane, pretty bureaucratic. So some people might be drawn to the excitement of espionage. It could be a powerful motivator.
It's a world that just seems inherently filled with paranoia. You're constantly looking over your shoulder, never quite knowing who to trust.
Paranoia and betrayal.
Yeah.
Those are really the heart of spy fiction. The genre plays on that fundamental uncertainty, the possibility that anyone, even someone you think you know well, could be a double agent.
Early spy novels often had a very black and white view of things, right? Good guys versus bad guys.
Yes, very much so. The West versus the communist threat or the Nazi threat before that. But as the genre matured, things became much more nuanced, especially in the 70s and 80s. You start to see more moral ambiguity, a recognition that there are shades of gray on both sides.
The end of the Cold War also changed things, right? The old enemy was gone, so who was the new threat?
Exactly. The rise of terrorism, cyber terrorism, those became the new anxieties. But even as the external threats changed, those core themes, paranoia, betrayal, the struggle for individual morality, those remained at the heart of the genre.
And then there's that real-life example that really shook things up. The Cambridge 5 spy ring. That must have just fueled the paranoia to an incredible degree.
The Cambridge Five, that was a huge blow to British intelligence. You had Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess defecting in 1951, and then the others, Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, being exposed later. These were highly educated, well-connected individuals, people who were trusted, who were in positions of power.
And they had been recruited while they were students at Cambridge, right?
Right.
Back in the 1930s.
Yes. And their motivations were complex. Philby seemed to be driven by a genuine belief in communism. Blunt, maybe it was more about intellectual arrogance, the thrill of secrecy. Whatever their reasons, the damage they did was significant. It created this atmosphere of deep distrust, of suspicion towards anyone who might have those same kinds of backgrounds, those same kinds of connections.
And that brings us to John le Carré. He lived through all of this. He saw firsthand how the world of espionage was changing. So what was his background before he became a writer?
His real name was David Cornwell, and he had a fascinating life even before he started writing. He was educated in Switzerland and at Oxford, served in British Army intelligence during World War II, and later he worked for the Foreign Office, which included a stint with MI6. He had to adopt the pseudonym John le Carré because, well, intelligence officers weren't allowed to publish under their own names back then.
Le Carré means the square in French, right?
It does. And there are different theories about why he chose it. Maybe it was a reference to the layout of his first publisher's offices. No one's really sure. But anyway, his debut novel, Call for the Dead, came out in 1961. But it was his third novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, published in 1963, that really made him famous. That book kind of changed the game for spy fiction. It moved away from those simpler good versus evil narratives and brought in this sense of moral ambiguity, of pervasive paranoia.
So let's delve into some of his key works, starting with Tailor Soldier Spy, published in 1974. This one's very closely tied to the Cambridge 5 scandal, right?
Very much so. It's widely considered a roman à clef, which is a novel that uses fictional characters to represent real people and events. The suspected mole in the book, Gerald, he's clearly based on Kim Philby. And the whole atmosphere of the novel, this sense of deep paranoia within British intelligence, that's very much inspired by the real-world fallout from the Cambridge Five.
And the organization at the heart of the novel, the British Secret Service, is called the Circus, right? What a great name.
It is, yeah. And a key part of the story is that it's almost impossible to conduct an internal investigation when the person you're investigating might be in control of the very machinery of the investigation. So they bring in George Smiley, who's semi-retired, to do this unofficial secret investigation.
So it's like a spy trying to catch a spy.
Exactly. The novel even asks that question directly. Who can spy on the spies? And George Smiley himself is such a compelling character. He's so different from the typical action hero spy.
He's very introspective, very methodical, not a James Bond type at all.
Not at all. And his character was inspired by several real people. John Bingham, who was a former MI5 officer, is thought to have been one inspiration. And then there was Vivian Green, who was le Carré's chaplain at school and later his tutor at Oxford. He's said to have contributed to Smiley's quiet demeanor and his intellectual background. Some critics have even drawn a comparison between Smiley and Stephen Dedalus from James Joyce's Ulysses.
What about some of the other key characters in Tailor Soldier Spy? Are they based on real people too? Like Connie Sachs, the eccentric expert on Soviet intelligence?
Yeah, Connie Sachs is believed to be based on Millicent Baggett, a real MI5 analyst who was one of the first to have serious doubts about Kim Philby. And then there's Bill Hayden, the charming but ultimately treacherous character who turns out to be the mole. He's thought to be inspired by George Kennedy Young, who was a high-ranking MI6 officer. The way the narrative unfolds is fascinating. Smiley slowly pieces together the truth through these discrete interrogations by re-examining past events, and eventually he exposes Hayden.
Even the code names for the suspects are interesting. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. It's like something out of a children's rhyme.
Exactly. And that just adds to the sense that something familiar, something trusted has been corrupted. There's also that whole storyline about the Soviet agent Volkov who tries to defect and has information about the mole. That feels very rooted in real events.
Yeah, it reminded me of the Guzenko affair in Canada after World War II. A Soviet cipher clerk who defected and brought with him evidence of Soviet espionage in the West.
Exactly. It's a fascinating parallel. And while le Carré never explicitly confirmed it, it's widely believed that the Volkov storyline in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is based on the Guzenko case. There's even speculation that Philby himself might have tipped off the Soviets about Guzenko.
And then there's Karla, the shadowy Soviet spy master. He's almost a mythical figure, isn't he? The man without a face.
He's a chilling presence throughout le Carré's novels. A lot of people initially thought he was based on Marcus Wolf, the head of East German intelligence, but le Carré denied that. More recently, some researchers have identified his likely inspiration as Rem Krasilnikov, a high-ranking KGB officer. Interestingly, both his surname and the Russian word for communism start with the letter K, which le Carré might have been playing on when he chose the name Karla.
The scene where Smiley and Karla briefly meet in that Indian jail is so powerful. It's almost like this microcosm of the entire Cold War.
It's a brilliant scene, this quiet, almost wordless encounter in a sweltering prison cell. Smiley thinks Karla might be vulnerable, might even be considering defection. He tries to connect with him, even offers him his gold cigarette lighter. But Karla remains completely impassive. It's a battle of wills, a clash of ideologies, all played out in silence.
And it has a profound impact on Smiley, doesn't it?
It does. He starts to question the fundamental differences between himself and his adversary. He sees Karla's humanity, even though they're on opposite sides of this ideological divide. Le Carré himself has said that in that moment, Smiley might have misjudged Karla, mistaking his stoicism for strength, when it might have been a reflection of internal turmoil.
And Jim Prideaux, Smiley's old friend and colleague, his story is so tragic. He's betrayed, tortured, physically and emotionally broken.
Jim Prideaux is a fascinating and complex character. He's this embodiment of the physical and psychological costs of the spy game. There's even speculation that his character was partly inspired by le Carré's own schoolmaster.
And his codename, Ellis, is also a codename that Guy Burgess used in real life. It's like another layer of betrayal.
Exactly. And his mission to Czechoslovakia, which turns out to be a trap orchestrated by Hayden and Karla, it's just heartbreaking. He's left completely shattered.
It's interesting to think about the motivations for betrayal in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Yeah.
What drives someone like Bill Hayden to do what he does?
Le Carré has talked about how he saw Kim Philby's betrayal as being rooted in disillusionment with the decline of the British Empire and a resentment towards the growing power of the U.S. But the novel also offers other interpretations. Some critics have argued that Hayden's motivations stem from a kind of emptiness, a lack of meaning. It's like he's rebelling against the world that feels increasingly meaningless.
The way Smiley eventually exposes Hayden has this almost biblical feel to it, like a reverse Garden of Gethsemane.
There's definitely a parallel there. Hayden's handler, the Russian general Polyakov, he's like a Judas figure. He leads Hayden into this trap, not with a kiss, but with an offer of a drink. And even after Hayden is caught, Smiley feels this mix of emotions: disgust, anger, but also weariness, and even a strange kind of sympathy.
Unlike Philby, who escaped to Moscow, Hayden meets a violent end. And it's implied that Prideaux is the one who kills him.
It is, yeah. And Smiley, who probably knows the truth, chooses not to reveal it. Maybe it's a sign of understanding, of recognition of the pain that Prideaux has endured. But the novel ends with this sense of unease, the lingering paranoia that betrayal is always possible. It's only later in subsequent novels that Karla himself is brought down. And it's not through ideology or force. It's through his love for his daughter.
That's a fascinating twist. It suggests that even someone like Karla, this seemingly invincible master spy, has this deeply human vulnerability.
Exactly. And in the end, Smiley recognizes that shared ground between them. It reinforces the novel's themes of corrupted intimacy, of the erosion of trust, of how loyalty and betrayal can become so entangled.
Now let's fast forward to 1995 and le Carré's novel Our Game. The world has changed dramatically. The Cold War is over. What new anxieties does le Carré grapple with in this book?
Our Game marks a real shift for le Carré. He's writing in a post-Cold War world, and the new threat is unbridled nationalism, particularly Russian nationalism. There's this sense that the old certainties are gone and new, unpredictable forces are emerging.
And the protagonist, Tim Cranmer, he's quite different from George Smiley, isn't he?
He is, yeah. Kramer's a retired spy who's settled into this comfortable, even somewhat complacent life. But then he gets drawn back into the world of espionage when his former protege, Larry Pettifer, becomes involved with English separatists in the Caucasus.
The English, that's a group in the North Caucasus region of Russia, right? They've been fighting for independence for a long time.
Exactly. And Larry, who's a bit of a romantic, a bit of an idealist, gets caught up in their cause.
And Cranmer is drawn into this conflict, even though he wants to stay out of it.
He is, yeah. Both British intelligence and the Russian security services start to suspect him, to think he knows more than he's letting on.
Mhm.
And then there's this other group, the Ossetian nationalists, who add another layer of complexity and danger to the situation.
So the world has become even more fragmented, even more volatile after the Cold War.
It has. And the themes of loyalty and betrayal take on new dimensions in this context. Is Larry betraying his country by supporting the English? Or is he being true to a higher moral calling? And what about Cranmer? Is he betraying himself by trying to stay detached, to ignore what's happening?
It's interesting that Larry's partner is Cranmer's former lover. That adds another layer of personal entanglement to the story.
It does. And le Carré is very good at exploring those kinds of complex relationships, those blurred lines between personal and professional loyalties. Larry himself is a fascinating character. He's almost like a ghost, a figure from Cranmer's past who haunts him. There are even hints that Larry might not be entirely real, that he might be a figment of Cranmer's imagination.
So it's a story about disillusionment, about the struggle to find meaning in a world that's lost its old certainties.
Very much so. And le Carré contrasts Cranmer's world, this kind of morally lethargic West, with the passion and commitment of the English. It's like he's saying that the West has lost its sense of purpose, its sense of conviction.
And he gives a lot of attention to portraying the English people and their culture.
He does, yeah. He clearly has a deep sympathy for them, for their struggle. And Cranmer, through his involvement with Larry, comes to understand and even admire their commitment to their cause.
The ending is quite ambiguous, isn't it? We're left wondering whether Larry is really dead or whether he's just disappeared.
It is, yeah. And I think that ambiguity is intentional. It reflects the uncertainty of the post-Cold War world. The old rules no longer apply, and nothing is certain.
So finally, let's move on to The Constant Gardener, published in 2001. This one feels like another major shift for le Carré.
It is. In The Constant Gardener, le Carré turns his attention to a new kind of enemy, multinational corporations, specifically the pharmaceutical industry and its practices in Africa.
And this was inspired by some very real issues, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Unethical drug trials, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, the falsification of data. Le Carré was really disturbed by what he uncovered during his research, and the novel reflects that.
The protagonist, Justin Quayle, he's a very different kind of le Carré hero, too. He starts out as this rather passive, unassuming diplomat.
Yeah, he's a quiet, almost invisible man. But then his wife, Tessa, who's a passionate activist, is murdered. And that event transforms him. He becomes determined to find out the truth about her death and to expose the corruption that he believes led to it.
So he's like this ordinary man who gets thrust into this extraordinary situation.
Exactly. And he's up against this incredibly powerful and ruthless adversary, the pharmaceutical giant KVH. Le Carré doesn't hold back in his portrayal of their cynicism and greed.
And Tessa's character is based on a real person, right? Yvette Pierpali, the aid worker.
That's right. Le Carré admired her greatly. And even the names in the novel have symbolic significance. Garth, the garden. Freesia, a flower associated with weddings. Lorbeer, the German word for laurel, which has medicinal properties. Bloom, relating to bloom.
It's interesting how the paranoia and betrayal that are so central to le Carré's Cold War novels are also present in The Constant Gardener, but in a different context.
They are, yeah. Tessa's paranoid about the forces aligned against her, the people who want to silence her. And Justin becomes paranoid as he gets drawn deeper into her world, realizing that he's being watched, manipulated.
And the betrayal comes from multiple sources. The pharmaceutical company betraying the patients in their drug trials, the government betraying its own people by failing to regulate these corporations, and even Justin, in a way, betrays Tessa through his initial detachment from her activism.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered portrayal of how trust can be eroded, how systems can be corrupted. And le Carré is clearly arguing that in the absence of a clear enemy like the Soviet Union, corporate power has become the new threat.
It's a chilling but also very important message, and it's interesting that the novel is said to have had a real impact on the pharmaceutical industry, on making AIDS drugs more accessible in developing countries.
It did, yeah. Le Carré himself said that he was more proud of that impact than any literary awards he'd received. It shows that fiction can have real-world consequences, can really make a difference.
So as we look back at these three novels, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Our Game, and The Constant Gardener, it's amazing to see how Le Carré's focus evolved over time.
It is. From the Cold War to the post-Cold War world to the era of globalization and corporate power. He was always attuned to the shifting political and social landscape, always identifying the new threats, the new sources of anxiety.
But despite those changing external forces, those core themes of paranoia, betrayal, and moral struggle, those remained constant.
Absolutely. And that's what makes his work so enduring, so relevant. He tapped into something fundamental about the human condition.
And his contribution to literature is immense. He really changed the way we think about espionage.
He did. He brought a new level of realism, a new level of moral complexity to the genre. He showed us that the world of spies isn't just about gadgets and action. It's about human beings making difficult choices, facing impossible dilemmas.
As we wrap up our deep dive, it leaves you thinking about some pretty big questions. Where does true loyalty lie in a world where everything is constantly shifting? How do we navigate the potential for betrayal that exists in every relationship and every institution? What's our responsibility as individuals when faced with corruption and injustice?
Those are the